In 1304 Scotland, the movie begins in front of Stirling Castle. The Scottish nobility, including Robert the Bruce and John Cummin, swear an oath to King Edward I of England. After losing at the Battle of Falkirk, 1298, the notorious Scottish rebel William Wallace fled into hiding, and the English gained the upper hand in the conflict with their northern neighbours' effort at independence. Several Scottish lords have made the difficult decision to submit to English power once more. In exchange, Robert is guaranteed the hand of Elizabeth de Burgh, an Irish noblewoman whose father is an ardent supporter and ally of Edward I. James Douglas, a Scot, requests the king for the return of his family's estates and titles, but Edward I declines on the grounds that his father was a traitor. The English king's son Edward II challenges Robert to a friendly duel as the noblemen start to leave. Robert fights Edward II half-heartedly to a stop before the prince is called by his father, and everyone is invited to watch as Edward I seals the treaty with the Scots by launching Greek fire at the nearby castle and ordering his commanders to accept the fortress surrender right away. Elizabeth soon shows up to formally wed Robert at home as Robert and his father start to deal with the realities of their submission, who chooses not to consummate the marriage. While the pressure of English rule wears on the populace, Elizabeth gradually warms up to Robert and his daughter Marjorie over the course of the months. Robert's father tells tales about his time as a young man fighting alongside King Edward in the Crusades, and although he first thought of him as a friend, he later comes to regret having done so. Shortly thereafter, Robert's father passes away, promoting him to the position of Lord of Annandale. Later in 1305, Robert and his entourage journeyed to Berwick, a border town, to deliver taxes due to England. Following this, Robert and his soldiers are engulfed in a crowd of spectators who have arrived in the marketplace to see William Wallace's arm after the rebel had finally been apprehended and been hanged, drawn, and quartered. Robert witnesses in horror as the English start mowing down Scottish commoners who retaliate as the crowd starts to yell and threaten the English soldiers. As Robert returns to his homeland, he gathers his friends and allies and tells them of Wallace's execution as well as his renewed resolve to rebel against English authority. Robert then makes the decision to gather the Scottish nobility and present his case for a second effort at independence. While some nobility support him, others, including John Cummin and those who do, refuse. Cummin eventually confronts Robert in a church, where they have a long argument. Robert pulls Cummin's knife from his belt and stabs him in the neck, murdering him at the altar, when the latter mentions his desire to warn King Edward of his schemes. Robert confesses the murder to the Scottish clergy in an effort to receive forgiveness for his deeds. The clergy then offers Robert the forgiveness he seeks in exchange for his consent to be crowned King of Scotland and to lead the nation in its fight against the English. James Douglas, who is on his way to pledging his devotion to Robert in exchange for the promise that his family's lands and titles will be returned to him, comes across Robert before he accepts the offer and is crowned king at the village of Scone. Edward I, who is still in England, is furious when he learns of Cummin's murder and Robert's coronation. Because to his failing health, Charles assigns Aymer de Valence to deal with the Scots who have been seen in large numbers nearby Perth. The king reluctantly agrees to Prince Edward II's request to let him kill or capture Robert in order to prove his mettle. He then knights hundreds of men to go with him and orders them to ride under the banner of a dragon, disregarding the principles of chivalry and showing no mercy to the enemy and or their supporters. Robert encounters de Valence on the field and, realizing that the English commander's force is vastly outnumbered, challenges him to a duel to determine who will prevail. De Valence agrees, but informs Robert that because it being a Sunday, the duel must take place the next day. The Scots, who are camping nearby in a forest, celebrate that evening and get ready for combat while Robert and Elizabeth passionately consummate their union. Following that, when they put Marjorie to sleep, Robert demands Elizabeth to swear to safeguard his daughter no matter what happens to him. When Robert goes to examine the weird noises outside their tent, volleys of fire arrows start to fall on the Scottish camp. De Valence has brought his warriors into range and launched a covert attack after deciding to break their pact. Battle of Methven. Robert assigns his brother Neil the task of escorting Elizabeth and Marjorie to Kildrummy Castle so they can seek safety from Lord Fraser, a friend and ally, as the English continue their onslaught and rout the majority of the Scottish. Robert puts up a fierce fight, but despite his best efforts, he is ultimately driven from the battle and escapes with only approximately 50 of his soldiers still alive. Angus MacDonald, one of Robert's supporters, lives in the home islands, so Robert and his men, who are exhausted, bruised, and beat, decide to head there in order to resupply their soldiers. They meander aimlessly across the Scottish countryside. They come upon a small MacDougall clan force along the route, but they don't hurt them because they were Cummin's followers. In a different location, Neil brings Elizabeth and Marjorie to Lord Fraser's castle, where they might escape the dire scenario that Robert's coronation has precipitated. In an attempt to cross a river, Robert and his men are ambushed by the MacDougalls. Alexander, Robert's brother, gets pierced by a spear during the fighting and his body is abandoned as the outlaw king's men continue to diminish. Finally making it to the islands, the little band of troops rests and heals while those who are able promise to join his armies. Returning on the mainland, Prince Edward II carves a violent path through Scotland, brutally executing Robert's allies and pillaging or conquering towns and villages, including Robert's own fortress. He chastises De Valence when he gets to Perth for letting the outlaw get away and for failing to find him. The prince rallies his warriors to face Lord Fraser when a devoted Scottish nobleman shows up shortly after and tells the English where Elizabeth and Marjorie are. The prince orders Lord Fraser to turn over Robert's wife and daughter upon his arrival in Kildrummy in order to avoid having to launch an attack. Neil gets Elizabeth and Marjorie outside the walls while the Lord buys some time by stating he is unaware of their whereabouts. Neil instructs them to wait and hide in the forest until he can send soldiers to protect them and transport them away. Lord Fraser proposes to open the gates and let the English in after launching a hail of fire arrows into the castle. Prince Edward II gestures for his men to come closer to prove that they have already taken Elizabeth and Marjorie while both Neil and Lord Fraser keep insisting they are not there. After ordering Neil to be hanged from the castle gates in response to their defiance, the prince is then disemboweled in front of his wife and child. His wife and daughter are to be taken as captives and returned to England once he personally slices Lord Fraser's throat. Robert hears about Neil's death and the arrest of his family on the island. The renegade king returns to the mainland with a strong desire for vengeance, where he proceeds to gather resources and supporters before realizing that confronting the English head-on will only lead to failure because his forces are still outnumbered by their foe. Instead, the Scots begin a strategy of guerrilla warfare, sneaking up on the enemy and attacking English defences in small groups. Robert gives James Douglas permission to take a few men to perform the same thing at his own keep after James Douglas had defeated the garrison at his own castle, and set it on fire. On Palm Sunday, the Douglas larder, Douglas infiltrates his family's castle. During Mass, when the majority of the English garrison is praying inside the church, Douglas makes himself known and repeatedly yells Douglas, as his men brutally murder their foes and set the castle on fire. After rallying support for his cause, Douglas rejoins Robert. When Elizabeth's parents and Prince Edward II try to persuade her to sign a contract that forsakes Robert, annuls their marriage, and pardons her for her crimes against the crown, Marjorie is whisked away by a nun in England to serve as a glorified hostage at a convent. Elizabeth is forced into a metal cage and dangled over the walls after she refuses to sign the document and mocks the prince for his ongoing failure to apprehend her husband. Meanwhile, King Edward I is becoming more and more conscious of his weakness and deteriorating health. As soon as he learns that Robert's forces have launched yet another raid, he becomes furious and decides to gather his army and march into Scotland by himself, determined to put an end to the rebellion in the same way that he had done when he had personally defeated William Wallace at Falkirk almost 10 years earlier. King Edward I passes out while on the march, at which point he gives his son the order to cook his body and take the bones to every battle he engages in with the Scots. The prince's last words to his father, which insult him and say that the reason the king treated him so badly was because he knew his son was stronger than himself and was terrified of that strength, are not loving as the king passes away from dysentery. Edward II dismisses his last request and orders his men to bury the late king there and immediately before leaving his father's tent. Robert chooses to ultimately engage the English in a pitched fight rather than continue to flee and hide as they get closer and closer. Despite their reluctance, his warriors decide to follow their king's lead and begin making plans. They pick a muddy ground to engage the English on and build huge ditches filled with sharpened stakes to surprise their strong cavalry. The next day, the two troops meet on the field, with the English numbering in the thousands while Robert's army is barely over 500 strong. James Douglas is entrusted with intercepting the prince and giving them fight at the predetermined site, the Battle of Loudon Hill. Edward II commands De Valence and several of his heavy cavalry to charge Robert's ready army in an effort to establish his authority and solidify his position as the new King of England. The English discover the traps prepared for them too late, and as both horses and knights perish in the stake-lined holes, a vicious muddy melee breaks out. The Scots continue to kill Englishmen and soon send them into a retreat even after Edward II himself enters the conflict with the rest of his forces. Robert and Edward II square off once more, with Robert coming out on top. Edward II is spared by Robert and given permission to retire with what remains of his army as the Scots king claims his first significant victory against the English. Edward II is battered and pleading for assistance. It is shown in the epilogue scene that Edward II would return to England and become king before being assassinated by his nobles decades later. While Angus MacDonald was elevated to the position of Lord of the Isles, James Douglas would go on to earn the nickname the Black Douglas and reclaim his family's territories. 300 years later, James VI, a descendant of Robert, would be crowned King of Scotland and England. Elizabeth is finally freed in a prisoner exchange and reunites with Robert and Marjorie. Well, that's all for today's video. We hope you enjoyed it, and please support us by subscribe to the channel and click on the bell icon to get notification for new videos every we post.